The golden light of a Texas sunrise revealed the silhouette of a lone rider cresting the hill, dust billowing behind him as he surveyed what should have been his empty cattle range. Preston York squinted beneath the brim of his weather-beaten hat, his jaw tightening at the unexpected sight below. His cattle gathered around a water trough while a woman, a stranger, scattered feed across the ground. This was his land, his livestock, and he hadn't hired anyone to tend them. Digging his heels into his chestnut mare's sides, he descended toward the homestead he'd left empty for months, determined to discover who had taken such liberties in his absence. The year was 1878, and the small town of Kingfisher, Texas, had grown considerably since Preston first staked his claim 5 years prior. At 32, he'd built his reputation as a skilled cattleman who preferred solitude to society. He'd left his herd to graze the open range while he drove a smaller group to market in Fort Worth, expecting to return to untouched land. Instead, he found someone had made themselves at home. As he approached, the woman turned. She wore a simple cotton dress, her dark hair pulled back beneath a faded bonnet. She shielded her eyes against the morning sun, watching his approach with a wariness that suggested she was prepared to defend her presence. Preston reined his horse to a stop, dust settling around them in the morning air. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat slightly but keeping his voice firm, "I believe you're on my property." The woman straightened her back, one hand still holding a basket of feed. "You'd be Mr. York then." "It wasn't a question. I am, and you're feeding my cattle. Someone had to." Her voice carried a slight tremor despite her defiant stance. "Name's Sarah Ellis. Your cattle wandered onto my property 3 months back, half-starved. I've been caring for them since." Preston frowned. "Your property?" "There's no neighboring claim that my husband purchased the Wilkins place before he passed. The deed's in order, Mr. York, filed properly in town." She gestured toward a small cabin visible through a stand of cottonwoods, one Preston hadn't noticed on his approach. "That parcel borders yours to the east. Wilkins sold out when, 6 months ago, Thomas, my husband, paid fair price." A shadow crossed her face. "He died 4 months back. Fever took him quick." Preston removed his hat, a gesture of respect despite his confusion. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Ellis, but that doesn't explain why you're on my land feeding my cattle. Like I said, they wandered, found them collapsed by the creek that divides our properties." She set down her basket. "I couldn't just watch them die. Been moving them between your grazing land and mine, keeping them fed. Figured their owner would return eventually." Preston studied her, noting the strength in her posture despite the evident exhaustion in her eyes. A widow, alone in this harsh country, taking on the burden of another's livestock instead of letting nature take its course. It didn't make sense. "That's considerable work for someone with their own homestead to manage," he said carefully. "I manage." The words carried both pride and exhaustion. Preston dismounted, his boots hitting the hard Texas soil with a thud. Up close, he could see Mrs. Ellis was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 26 or 27, with intelligent brown eyes that assessed him just as critically as he studied her. "I'll take them off your hands now," he said, "and compensate you for the feed." "No need. Your cattle helped clear my lower field. Saved me burning it off before planting." Preston wasn't accustomed to charity, especially not from a woman living alone in circumstances that were clearly challenging. "I pay my debts, Mrs. Ellis. As do I. Your cattle provided a service. We're square." She picked up her basket and turned toward the path that presumably led to her property. "They're all accounted for, 73 head, including 6 new calves." Preston blinked in surprise. His herd had numbered 67 when he'd left. "You delivered calves too?" She paused, a hint of a smile crossing her face for the first time. "Not my first season on a ranch, Mr. York. My father raised cattle in East Texas before the war." As she walked away, Preston found himself at a rare loss for words. He'd built his life around self-sufficiency, yet this woman had saved his livelihood while managing her own survival. The thought settled uncomfortably in his chest. "Mrs. Ellis," he called after her. When she turned, he added, "Thank you." She nodded once, then continued on her way, leaving Preston to wonder what kind of woman would extend such help to a stranger in a land where survival often depended on looking after oneself first. The next morning, Preston rode to Sarah Ellis's homestead, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies from town. He'd spent a sleepless night thinking about the widow's situation and his own ingrained habits of solitude. The idea of someone, particularly a woman alone, struggling on neighboring land, when he had the means to help, didn't sit right with him. The Ellis place was modest, but well-maintained. A small cabin with a covered porch stood in a clearing, surrounded by a vegetable garden showing the first signs of spring growth. A chicken coop and a small barn completed the homestead. It was less than Preston's sprawling operation, but impressive for someone managing alone. Sarah emerged from the barn carrying a milk pail as he approached. She wore trousers today beneath a long apron, practical clothing for ranch work that nonetheless emphasized her feminine form. She set down the pail when she saw him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. York," she said, caution evident in her greeting. Preston dismounted, removing his hat. "Mrs. Ellis, I've brought some supplies. Flour, coffee, sugar, and seed for your garden. Noticed you're planting." Her expression shifted from surprise to something harder. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity. It's payment for caring for my cattle." Before she could protest, he added, "My mother taught me to respect a person's pride, but she also said refusing a fair exchange is just another form of pride." Sarah studied him for a long moment. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was. He didn't elaborate on the past tense. After a moment, Sarah nodded. "Very well, you can put the supplies on the porch." As Preston began unloading the pack horse, she added, "Would you like some coffee? Just brewed a pot." The invitation surprised him, but he found himself accepting. That would be welcome. Inside, the cabin was small but meticulously organized. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while a table with 4 chairs occupied the center of the main room. Shelves held books more than Preston would have expected, and a few personal items. A curtain partitioned off what he assumed was a sleeping area. Sarah poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set one before him at the table. "Sugar. Black is fine, thank you." They sat in awkward silence for a moment before Sarah spoke. "I should thank you for the supplies. It's been difficult managing alone. You've done well, better than many men I've known who tried to stake a claim out here." She offered a small smile. Thomas had big dreams. He saw this land and imagined a prosperous ranch. Never got the chance to build it. She sipped her coffee. "I couldn't bear to leave. Felt like abandoning his dream." "You're from East Texas, you said." "Yes. My father's ranch was destroyed during the war. We rebuilt afterward, but it was never the same. When I married Thomas 3 years ago, we decided to start fresh out west." Her eyes took on a distant look. "He was a good man, worked himself to exhaustion for our future." Preston understood that drive all too well. This land demands everything and promises nothing in return. Yet you've made it work. Your herd is healthy, your operation substantial. "Took years," Preston admitted, "and I started with more than most. My father left me enough to buy the land outright and stock it. Not everyone gets that advantage." Sarah studied him curiously. "You don't strike me as a man born to privilege, Mr. York." "Preston," he corrected. And no, not privilege. Just a father who believed in planning for his family's future. He was a businessman in St. Louis who invested wisely. What brought you to ranching? Seems a far cry from city business. Preston hadn't spoken about his past in years, yet found himself answering. My mother was Texas-born, told stories about open skies and freedom that a city could never provide. After they both passed within a year of each other, I decided to see this land she loved so much. He shrugged. Never looked back. And you've been alone all this time. The question carried no judgment, just curiosity, but Preston felt defensive nonetheless. I hire hands during roundup and driving season. Otherwise, I manage. As do I, she said, echoing her words from their first meeting. Their eyes met over their coffee cups, and Preston recognized in Sarah something he rarely encountered. A kindred spirit who understood both independence and the cost it exacted. Mr. York Preston, Sarah said, breaking the silence. I appreciate the supplies, truly. But I want to be clear, I'm not looking for a caretaker. I've chosen to stay and make this work. I understand. He set his empty cup down. But neighboring ranches traditionally help each other in these parts, not charity survival. If you're staying, then we're neighbors. She considered this, then nodded. Neighbors, then. As Preston rode back to his ranch that afternoon, he found himself thinking about Sarah Ellis's determination and the quiet strength she projected despite her circumstances. It had been a long time since he'd given much thought to anyone beyond his immediate concerns. Yet he couldn't help wondering how she would fare alone as summer approached, bringing its brutal heat and the constant threat of drought. For the first time in years, Preston York's solitary existence felt somehow incomplete. Over the following weeks, Preston fell into a new routine. Each morning, after tending to his own ranch duties, he would ride the boundary line between their properties, ostensibly checking fences but really watching for signs of Sarah's activity. Sometimes he spotted her in her fields, other times tending to a small herd of goats he hadn't noticed during his first visit. He limited his visits to her homestead, not wanting to impose, but found reasons to stop by every few days, bringing a repaired tool, offering fresh game from a hunt, or simply checking that all was well. Sarah maintained her independence, but gradually accepted these neighborly gestures with less resistance. One afternoon in late April, Preston arrived to find Sarah struggling with her plow. One of her mules had gone lame, and she was attempting to break ground for additional planting with just one animal pulling. Without asking permission, Preston unhitched his own horse and added it to the team. "This will go faster with proper power," he said, when Sarah began to protest. "I've finished my own plowing. Horse could use the exercise." They worked together throughout the afternoon, Preston guiding the plow while Sarah followed behind, dropping seeds into the freshly turned earth. The physical labor was familiar to them both, and they fell into a comfortable rhythm that required few words. As the sun began its descent, painting the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and purples, they paused to rest. Sarah offered Preston water from her canteen, which he accepted gratefully. "You're good with the land," he observed, watching as she surveyed the day's work with a critical eye. "Most folks who come out here see only the opportunity, not the reality of what it takes. My father taught me that land speaks its own language. You either learn to listen or you fail." She wiped sweat from her brow with her sleeve. "Thomas was still learning when he died. He had the passion but not the experience. And you? I've been listening to the land since I was a girl." She smiled faintly. "It's honest, at least. Demands much but doesn't deceive about what it requires." Preston nodded, understanding perfectly. "Unlike people." "Some people," she corrected. "Not all." Their eyes met, and Preston felt an unexpected connection, the silent recognition between two people who saw the world through similar lenses. It unsettled him how comfortable he felt in her presence, when he'd spent years preferring his own company to that of others. "Stay for supper," Sarah said suddenly. "I've got a rabbit stew that's been simmering all day, too much for just me." Preston should have declined. He had worked waiting at his own ranch, and establishing habits like shared meals created expectations he wasn't sure he wanted to fulfill. Yet he heard himself accepting before he'd fully considered the implications. Supper was simple but satisfying. The stew was rich with wild onions and the early vegetables from Sarah's garden. They ate on her porch as twilight settled around them, bringing with it the chorus of night insects and the distant howl of coyotes. "You ever get lonely?" Sarah asked abruptly, setting aside her empty bowl. "Out here by yourself?" Preston considered deflecting the question but found himself answering honestly. "Sometimes, not often enough to change my ways. Thomas and I used to talk for hours after supper, making plans, sharing stories." She looked out toward the darkening land. "I miss the sound of another voice in the evenings." "You could return to your family," Preston suggested, though the idea disturbed him more than he cared to admit. Sarah shook her head. "Nothing to return to. My parents are gone. My brother died at Shiloh. Thomas was my family." She looked at him directly. "What about you? No family back east wondering about you. A cousin in Chicago I write to at Christmas. That's all." He hadn't thought about family connections in years, having grown accustomed to his solitary existence. "I prefer it that way. Do you?" There was no challenge in her voice, only genuine curiosity. The question lingered between them as darkness fully claimed the land. Preston knew he should leave, return to his own property and the comfortable solitude he'd cultivated for years. Instead, he found himself sharing stories about his early days in Texas, the mistakes he'd made, the lessons he'd learned. Sarah laughed at his description of his first disastrous cattle drive, and the sound was warm and genuine in the cool evening air. When he finally rose to leave, the moon had risen, casting silver light across the landscape. "Thank you for supper," he said formally, suddenly aware of how much time had passed. "Thank you for your help today," Sarah replied. She stood on her porch, a slender figure in the moonlight. "And for the company." As Preston rode home, he found himself replaying their conversations, analyzing the comfort he'd felt in her presence. It had been years since he'd spent an entire evening simply talking with another person. The realization was both pleasant and alarming. He told himself it was merely neighborly concern that prompted his interest in Sarah Ellis's welfare. Yet as he prepared for bed that night, Preston acknowledged the truth he'd been avoiding. He was drawn to the widow in ways that had nothing to do with neighborly duty. The admission changed nothing, he decided firmly. Sarah was rebuilding her life after loss. The last thing she needed was the attention of a man who had deliberately chosen isolation over connection. Whatever unusual feelings might be stirring within him, Preston determined to keep them firmly contained. May brought scorching heat earlier than usual. The creek that divided their properties slowed to a trickle, and the lush spring grasses began to yellow under the relentless sun. Preston's cattle grew restless, searching for better grazing, and he found himself riding the boundaries more frequently to prevent strays. It was during one such ride that disaster struck. Preston was checking the western boundary when he spotted smoke rising from the direction of Sarah's homestead. Heart pounding, he spurred his horse into a gallop, covering the distance in minutes that normally took much longer. As he crested the final rise, he saw flames engulfing Sarah's barn. The fire crackled viciously in the dry air, consuming the wooden structure with terrifying speed. Near the burning building, Sarah fought a desperate battle with buckets of water, trying to prevent the flames from spreading to her cabin. Preston leaped from his horse before it had fully stopped, grabbing a nearby blanket and soaking it in the water trough. "The animals!" he shouted over the roar of the fire. "Out!" Sarah called back, her face streaked with soot. But everything else together, they fought the blaze, beating at the edges with wet blankets while the heart of the fire consumed the barn. The heat was overwhelming, singeing Preston's eyebrows and making it difficult to breathe. After what seemed like hours but was likely only 40 minutes, they managed to contain the fire to the barn alone, saving the cabin and the rest of the homestead. Exhausted, they collapsed on the ground at a safe distance, watching as the barn's frame crackled and finally caved in on itself. Sarah's face was blank with shock, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped sweat from her brow. "All my feed," she said dully. "The hay for winter, the tools, everything." Preston placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the fine tremors running through her body. "You're alive. The animals are safe. The rest can be replaced." "With what?" She turned to him, despair evident in her eyes. "That was everything Thomas and I had saved, all our planning for the future gone in minutes." Preston knew she was right. Without feed stored for the coming winter, without the tools necessary for maintaining a ranch, Sarah's chances of keeping her homestead through another season had diminished drastically. Even if she sold some of her stock now, the profits likely wouldn't be enough to rebuild and resupply before winter. "How did it start?" he asked gently. "I don't know. I was working in the garden by the time I smelled the smoke." She shook her head. "Maybe a spark from the forge. I was repairing a harness clip earlier." They sat in silence, watching the last of the flames die down to smoldering embers. Preston could feel Sarah pulling inward, her initial shock giving way to the cold calculations of survival that every rancher understood. "You'll stay with me tonight," he said finally. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Sarah started to protest, but Preston cut her off. "Your cabin's safe but full of smoke. You need rest before making decisions. One night, Sarah, that's all I'm asking." Eventually, she nodded, the fight gone out of her for the moment. Preston helped her gather a few personal items from the cabin, and they rode double on his horse to his ranch house as the sun began to set. Preston's home was larger than Sarah's cabin, a proper ranch house with 4 rooms and a wide porch wrapping around 2 sides. It was sparsely furnished but comfortable, built with an eye toward practicality rather than decoration. He showed Sarah to the small guest room he rarely used, offering her clean towels and privacy to wash away the soot and sweat of the day's battle. Later, as they sat at his kitchen table with bowls of hastily prepared stew, Preston watched Sarah push food around without eating. Her resilience seemed to have cracked, revealing the vulnerability beneath her strong exterior. "I can't start over again," she said quietly, setting down her spoon. "Not a third time." Preston understood her meaning immediately. She had rebuilt once after the war took her family's ranch, and again after coming west with Thomas. The barn fire represented more than lost supplies. It was the final blow to a spirit that had already endured too much. "You don't have to leave," he said, the words coming before he'd fully formed the thought. "We can rebuild the barn. I have timber cut that I was saving for expanding my corral. We can use that." Sarah looked up, suspicion replacing despair in her eyes. "Why would you do that? You barely know me." It was a fair question, one Preston wasn't entirely sure he could answer honestly, even to himself. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because out here neighbors help each other survive." He hesitated, then added, "And because I admire what you've accomplished on your own. It would be a shame to see that lost when it doesn't have to be." "I can't repay you. I'm not asking for repayment." She studied him, searching for hidden motives or conditions. Finding none, she asked, "What are you asking for, then?" Preston considered the question carefully. "A chance to help, nothing more." Sarah's eyes held his for a long moment before she nodded slightly. "All right, but I'll work alongside you, and when the winter feed comes in, I'll share my harvest to replace what you're giving now." "Fair enough." Preston extended his hand across the table, and after a brief hesitation, Sarah took it. Her palm was calloused from work but distinctly feminine against his larger hand. The contact lasted only seconds, but left an impression that lingered long after they'd finished their meal and retired to their separate rooms. Lying in bed that night, Preston listened to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving about his home. The guest room was adjacent to his own, and through the wall, he could hear Sarah's soft footsteps and the creak of the bed frame as she settled. He had lived alone for so long that he'd forgotten the comfort of sharing space with another human being. The knowledge that someone else breathed under his roof created a warmth in his chest he hadn't experienced in years. It was dangerous to become accustomed to such feelings, Preston reminded himself firmly. Sarah's presence was temporary, a response to emergency, nothing more. Once her barn was rebuilt and her immediate crisis resolved, she would return to her own homestead, and he to his solitude. Yet as sleep finally claimed him, Preston couldn't help wondering if the emptiness of his home would feel more pronounced once Sarah Ellis was gone. The following morning brought clarity and purpose. Over breakfast, Preston and Sarah devised a plan for rebuilding the barn smaller than the original but sufficient for her immediate needs. Preston would contribute the lumber and his labor. Sarah would manage the design and help with construction as much as possible. "We should start by clearing the debris," Sarah said, sketching a rough plan on a scrap of paper. "Salvage what we can from the ruins." Preston nodded, impressed by her practical approach. Any tears she might have shed had been private. In the morning light, she showed only determination to move forward. They rode to her property after breakfast, the journey filled with practical discussion rather than the awkward silence Preston had expected. Upon arrival, the full extent of the damage was clear. The barn was completely destroyed, leaving only a blackened foundation and twisted metal from tools and equipment. Without discussing it, they both removed their coats and set to work. The day was spent sifting through ashes, setting aside anything salvageable which wasn't much and clearing space for new construction. The work was dirty and disheartening, but Sarah approached it with the same quiet strength she seemed to bring to everything. By late afternoon, they had made significant progress. The site was largely cleared, and Preston had ridden back to his ranch to begin bringing lumber on his wagon. As he worked alongside Sarah, he found himself watching her more often than necessary, noticing the graceful efficiency of her movements despite the grueling labor. It had been years since Preston had worked closely with anyone, especially a woman. He was surprised by how naturally they fell into complementary rhythms, anticipating each other's needs and sharing the burden without discussion. Over the next week, a routine developed. They would begin work at dawn, break during the most intense heat of midday, then continue until dusk threatened. Sarah had insisted on returning to her cabin after the first night, despite Preston's concerns about her being alone after such a shock. She remained firm, however, and he respected her decision, though he found himself riding to her property each morning with a strange anticipation that had nothing to do with construction work. The new barn began to take shape, a sturdy, simple structure that would serve Sarah's needs while requiring fewer resources than its predecessor. Preston had contacts in town who provided roofing materials at reasonable prices, and Sarah's design incorporated clever use of space that would maximize storage while minimizing the materials needed. They rarely spoke of personal matters during this time, focusing instead on the task at hand. Yet Preston found himself sharing small details of his life, almost without realizing it, his preference for sunrise over sunset, his mother's recipe for corn bread that he still used, the names he'd given to particular stars that guided him home on late rides. In turn, Sarah revealed glimpses of herself, her love of reading that had begun as a child, her skill at playing the harmonica, though her instrument had been lost in the fire, her dream of someday breeding horses alongside cattle. These exchanges happened naturally during water breaks or meals, creating an easy companionship that Preston found increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere neighborly concern. On the 10th day of construction, as they were setting the final roof supports, disaster nearly struck again. Preston was working on the uppermost beam when the ladder beneath him shifted on the uneven ground. He felt the moment of weightlessness as it began to fall, heard Sarah's warning shout from below. Instinctively, he grabbed for the nearest support, managing to catch himself before falling completely. The ladder clattered to the ground, leaving Preston dangling 15 feet above the dirt floor of the half-finished barn. "Hold on," Sarah called, already dragging the ladder back into position. "Don't let go." "Wasn't planning to," Preston replied through gritted teeth, his arms straining with the effort of supporting his entire weight. Sarah positioned the ladder and climbed quickly, reaching the top just as Preston's grip began to weaken. "Can you swing your legs toward me?" she asked, extending her arms as far as she safely could. With a grunt of effort, Preston managed to swing slightly, allowing Sarah to grab his belt. Together, they maneuvered him onto the ladder, the wood creaking ominously under their combined weight. They descended carefully, both breathing heavily from exertion and fright. When they reached the ground, Sarah's professional composure finally broke. She stepped forward and struck Preston's chest with an open palm. "You could have been killed," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. "What were you thinking, not securing the ladder properly?" Preston, startled by both her touch and her emotional response, caught her hand before she could deliver another blow. "I was careless. I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't mend broken bones or worse." The fear in her eyes was raw and unguarded. "I've buried one man on this property. I won't bury another." The words hung between them, revealing more than perhaps she'd intended. Preston still held her hand, and he became acutely aware of their proximity close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, smell the lavender soap she used despite her practical nature. "Sarah," he began, uncertain what he intended to say. She withdrew her hand abruptly, composure returning like a shield being raised. "We should secure that ladder properly. There's still work to finish before sundown." The moment passed, but its impact lingered. As they resumed work, more cautiously now, Preston replayed her words in his mind. The implication that his safety mattered to her personally, not just as a helpful neighbor, awakened feelings he'd kept dormant for years. That evening, as they shared a simple supper at Sarah's cabin, now cleared of smoke and restored to habitability, the earlier tension had dissolved into a different kind of awareness. Their conversation remained focused on practical matters, the next day's tasks, supplies needed from town, plans for replanting the kitchen garden that had been neglected during construction, but underneath ran a current of unspoken recognition. Sarah had shown her hand, revealing that Preston had become more than a convenient ally in her time of need. And Preston, despite his long cultivated independence, found he could no longer pretend his interest was purely neighborly. As he prepared to leave for his own ranch, Sarah walked him to his horse. The evening was unusually cool for early summer, with a breeze carrying the scent of distant rain. Good weather for sleeping, Preston thought, though he doubted sleep would come easily tonight. "Thank you," Sarah said as he mounted, "for today, for everything." "The barn will be finished within the week," Preston replied, deliberately misunderstanding her broader meaning. "Then you'll be set for the season." Sarah looked up at him, moonlight silvering her features. "And then what, Preston? You return to your solitude and I to mine. After all this," the directness of her question caught him off guard. Sarah Ellis, he was learning, was not a woman who shrouded her thoughts in polite evasions. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I've been alone a long time. It's what I know. As have I since Thomas died." She placed a hand on his horse's neck, steadying herself or perhaps ensuring he couldn't ride away without answering. "But these past weeks have reminded me there are worse things than being alone. There's being alone when you don't have to be." Preston had no ready response. The walls he'd built around himself over years weren't easily dismantled, even when he recognized their purpose might no longer serve him. "I should go," he said finally. "Early start tomorrow." Sarah stepped back, disappointment evident in the set of her shoulders. "Good night, then." As Preston rode home through the darkness, he confronted the truth he'd been avoiding. He was falling in love with Sarah Ellis. The realization should have terrified him. Love meant vulnerability, dependence, the very things he'd structured his life to avoid. Yet alongside the fear ran a current of something else. Possibility. The chance for a life different from the one he'd resigned himself to living. He had no idea if Sarah felt the same. Her words suggested interest, perhaps even affection, but love. That was a leap he wasn't sure either of them was prepared to make, especially with the shadow of her deceased husband still present in her life. Preston's thoughts churned as he approached his ranch house, the home that had once represented everything he wanted, and now suddenly seemed empty in ways he hadn't previously recognized. The decision facing him wasn't simple. Continue as he had been, safely isolated but increasingly aware of what he lacked, or risk reaching for something more, with all the potential for pain that entailed. By the time he reached his door, Preston still hadn't resolved his internal debate. But for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a different future than the one he'd assumed was fixed. The mere act of consideration felt like a step into unknown territory, frightening but oddly exhilarating. The next morning brought the promised rain, a steady downpour that precluded any construction work. Preston used the opportunity to ride into Kingfisher, ostensibly for supplies but really seeking space to think away from both his ranch and Sarah's presence. The small town was quiet in the rain, with few people braving the muddy streets. Preston secured his horse outside the general store and stepped inside, shaking water from his hat. The store owner, Harold Jenkins, looked up from his ledger with surprise. "Preston York, twice in 1 month. Must be some kind of record," he said good-naturedly. Preston managed a smile. He was known in town as a man who conducted his business efficiently and departed without lingering for gossip or social niceties. "Need some items, Harold, and information if you have it." While gathering the supplies he needed, Preston casually inquired about the Ellis homestead and its history. Harold, always ready to share local knowledge, was happy to oblige. Thomas Ellis was a good sort. Enthusiastic, maybe bit naive about ranching, but decent. Paid fair prices, treated folks right. Harold weighed coffee beans as he spoke. "The widow's been in a few times. Keeps to herself mostly, but folks respect her. Not many women would stay on alone after losing a husband out here. No family to return to, none she's mentioned. There was talk she might sell to the Harrington outfit when Ellis died. They've been buying up small claims all through the county, but she refused. Harold wrapped the coffee in brown paper. Determined woman. Preston nodded, considering this information. What do you know about Harrington's operation, growing fast? Based out of Austin originally, been expanding north for 3 years now. Harold lowered his voice slightly. Between us, they don't always take no gracefully. Some folks who have refused to sell have reported cattle missing, fences cut. Nothing proven, mind you. A chill that had nothing to do with his rain-soaked clothes ran through Preston. Sarah's barn burned last week. No clear cause. Harold's expression grew serious. You think Harrington's men might be involved? I don't know, but worth keeping in mind. Preston gathered his purchases, adding, I'd appreciate if this conversation stayed between us. Always does, Preston. You know that. On the ride home, Preston's thoughts were darker than before. If Harrington's outfit was indeed pressuring smaller ranchers to sell, Sarah might face more dangers than just the natural challenges of maintaining her homestead. The possibility added urgency to his unresolved feelings, not because Sarah needed protection, but because she deserved to know all the factors affecting her future. The rain continued throughout the day, turning to a gentle mist by evening. Preston completed his own ranch chores, then found himself riding towards Sarah's property despite the weather and fading light. He told himself he merely wanted to check that the partially constructed barn hadn't suffered damage in the downpour, but honesty compelled him to acknowledge his simpler motive. He wanted to see her. Sarah answered his knock wearing a faded house dress, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual practical arrangement. The sight momentarily robbed Preston of his planned opening. You're soaked through, she said, stepping back to admit him. Come in before you catch your death. The cabin was warm from the cooking fire, the air rich with the scent of baking bread. Preston removed his dripping hat and coat, hanging them near the door. I was in town today, he said without preamble. Heard some things you should know. Sarah's expression grew wary as Preston relayed what Harold had shared about Harrington's operation and their tactics. When he suggested the barn fire might not have been an accident, she sat heavily in one of her kitchen chairs. I had an offer from them, 2 months after Thomas died. Her voice was steady despite the concern in her eyes. The man Harrington's representative seemed surprised when I refused, said a woman alone couldn't manage a ranch, that I was being foolish. But nothing threatening, not explicitly. He said I'd regret missing the opportunity and that the offer wouldn't remain open indefinitely. She shook her head. I dismissed it as typical business tactics, never connected it to the fire. Could be coincidence, Preston acknowledged, but worth being vigilant. Sarah studied him, her gaze penetrating. Is that why you came tonight, to warn me? Partly. The admission cost him some effort, and partly because I wanted to see you. The simple truth hung between them. Sarah's expression softened, the wariness giving way to something warmer. I'm glad. I've been thinking about our conversation last night, as have I. Preston moved to sit across from her at the table. Sarah, I'm not good at this, at people. I've been on my own a long time, so you've said. There was gentle humor in her voice, several times in fact, because it matters. I don't want to make promises I can't keep or create expectations I can't fulfill. Sarah reached across the table, her hand covering his. Preston, I'm not asking for promises. I'm simply acknowledging what already exists between us, whatever you want to call it. The touch of her hand was warm and steady, anchoring him. And what would you call it? A beginning. Her smile was tentative but genuine. The rest we figure out as we go. Isn't that how ranching works? You make the best plan you can, then adapt to whatever comes. The analogy made Preston smile despite his nervousness. Seems I've met the one person more practical than myself. not more practical, just differently experienced. She squeezed his hand once, then released it. Stay for supper. The bread's almost done and I've got stew keeping warm. The invitation was simple, but Preston recognized it for what it was: not just an offer of food, but of companionship without pressure or demands. I'd like that. They ate together, conversation flowing more easily than Preston had anticipated. The topics ranged from practical ranch matters to books they'd read, childhood memories, and hopes for the coming season. Sarah spoke of Thomas occasionally, not with the raw grief of recent loss, but with the fond remembrance of a chapter closed. Preston found himself sharing more about his parents than he had with anyone in years: his father's meticulous business mind, his mother's love of poetry, despite her practical Texas upbringing. When the meal ended, neither seemed eager to conclude the evening. Sarah made coffee, and they moved to sit before the fire, the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof creating a cocoon of intimacy around them. "Tell me about your dream," Preston said suddenly. "You mentioned breeding horses alongside cattle." Sarah's face lit up with enthusiasm as she described her vision: a small but select breeding program focused on horses with both stamina and intelligence, suited to the demands of Texas ranching. Her knowledge was impressive, clearly built on years of observation and study rather than idle fancy. "Thomas thought it impractical," she admitted. "Said we needed to establish the cattle operation first, make it profitable before diversifying." "He wasn't wrong," Preston said, "but neither was your vision flawed, just a matter of timing and resources. And now. Preston considered carefully. "The foundations are there. Your land is good for horses, better water access than mine, more sheltered grazing. With the right start, it could work. Are you offering business advice, Preston York?" There was teasing in her voice, but genuine interest beneath it. "Maybe, or a partnership." The word slipped out before he could consider its implications. "Our properties adjoin. Your land has advantages mine lacks, and mine has scale yours doesn't. Together." He trailed off, suddenly aware he was proposing something that went beyond business, however practical the framing. Sarah set down her coffee cup, her expression serious. "A partnership. For the ranching," Preston clarified hastily. "I'm not suggesting that is, I wouldn't presume, Preston." Her interruption was gentle but firm. "I know what you're suggesting, and what you're not. Yet." The final word hung between them, filled with possibility. Preston found himself at a crossroads: retreat into comfortable ambiguity or step forward into unfamiliar territory. Sarah waited, patient but expectant. "I care for you," he said finally, the words inadequate but honest. "More than I expected to care for anyone again, maybe ever." Sarah moved closer, close enough that he could see the firelight reflected in her eyes. "Is that so terrible?" "Terrifying," he admitted. "But not terrible, not at all." When Sarah leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, Preston's last reservations dissolved. The kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. He answered by drawing her closer, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other found the curve of her waist. Time seemed suspended as they explored this new dimension of their connection. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "It's late and there's work tomorrow." Sarah nodded, though she made no move to release him. The rain stopped, moon's out. Good riding weather. Yet Preston remained seated, Sarah's hand now entwined with his. "Or you could stay." Her voice was steady despite the boldness of the suggestion. "Not for I mean, the guest room is made up. It's practical, with an early start tomorrow." Preston understood what she was offering. Proximity without presumption. a step forward that respected both their developing feelings and the propriety they'd been raised to observe. "People will talk," he said, though he found he cared less about that prospect than he once might have. "People already talk. I'm a widow living alone who's rebuilding with the help of a bachelor neighbor." Sarah smiled wryly. "Our reputations are likely already compromised in some eyes." Preston laughed softly. "When did you become so philosophical about gossip?" "When I realized some things matter more than others' opinions." She rose, tugging his hand gently. "Stay, Preston. We'll face whatever comes tomorrow together." The word together resonated through him, both promise and challenge. Preston stood, decision made. Together, then. The following morning brought clear skies and a return to construction work. If their interaction seemed different to outside observers, more comfortable, characterized by shared glances and occasional touches, no one was present to notice. They worked efficiently, making up for the lost rainy day, and by sunset had completed the barn's basic structure. "Another week should finish it," Preston observed as they cleaned tools in the last light of day. "Just the interior work and doors remaining." "It feels like a miracle," Sarah said, gazing at the structure. "A month ago I thought I'd lose everything. Now—" She didn't finish the sentence, but her glance toward Preston completed the thought. Now they both had more than they'd started with, and it wasn't measured in lumber or livestock. Preston had returned to his own ranch the previous night, despite Sarah's invitation to stay. Not because he didn't want to remain, but because he needed time to process the rapid evolution of his feelings and consider their implications. Independence had been his defining characteristic for so long that its gradual dissolution both exhilarated and alarmed him. Yet as days passed, and the barn neared completion, Preston found himself spending more evenings at Sarah's cabin than his own home. They established a routine: work during daylight hours, shared meals in the evening, and conversations that stretched well into the night. Occasionally, he would stay in her guest room, though they maintained the boundaries of propriety despite their growing closeness. The partnership they'd discussed began taking tangible form. Preston helped Sarah select 2 young mares from a breeder passing through the region, the foundation of her horse program, while she assisted him in improving his cattle bloodlines with her experienced eye for quality breeding stock. They discussed winter preparations, spring planting, and long-term improvements to both properties with the easy collaboration of people who assumed a shared future. They didn't speak directly of marriage, though the possibility hovered in their interactions. Preston knew Sarah was still honoring Thomas's memory in her own way, and he respected her need to close one chapter before beginning another. For his part, he was still reconciling his long-held belief in self-sufficiency with his growing desire for partnership in all aspects of life. June turned to July, bringing brutal heat that limited work to early mornings and late evenings. The barn was completed, stronger and more functional than its predecessor. Sarah's garden thrived under their shared attention, and Preston's cattle fattened on the summer grasses, promising good profits at the fall markets. It was during this period of relative calm that trouble finally materialized. Preston was riding the boundary line one evening when he spotted 3 riders approaching from the east from the direction of the main road, rather than from town. Something about their purposeful approach raised his instincts, and he adjusted his course to intercept them before they reached Sarah's cabin. The men reined in when they saw Preston, spreading out slightly in a manner that struck him as intentionally intimidating. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a trimmed beard, touched his hat in mock politeness. "Afternoon. Looking for the Ellis place." Preston remained mounted, one hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. "You're on York land now. Ellis property is adjacent. What's your business?" The man smiled thinly. "Name's Weber. Represent Mr. James Harrington. Our business is with Mrs. Ellis, not yourself. Mrs. Ellis is occupied. I can deliver a message." The three men exchanged glances. The one called Weber seemed to reassess the situation, his eyes taking in Preston's confident posture and the quality of his horse and gear. "You'd be Preston York, then. Heard you've been assisting the widow." The insinuation was clear, but Preston let it pass. "Your message." Weber straightened in his saddle. "Mr. Harrington is still interested in acquiring the Ellis property. Previous offer still stands, though he's willing to negotiate terms if Mrs. Ellis has reconsidered her position." "She hasn't." Preston kept his tone neutral despite his growing certainty that he was facing the men responsible for the barn fire. "The Ellis ranch isn't for sale. Not now, not later." "That's for her to decide, isn't it?" Weber's friendly facade slipped slightly. "Women can be emotional about property, especially when it holds memories. But Mrs. Ellis should consider practical realities. Ranching isn't getting easier for small operators." "I'll convey your concern for her welfare," Preston said dryly. "Anything else?" Weber studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "Just that Mr. Harrington doesn't make offers indefinitely. Opportunity has a way of expiring. Like barns have a way of burning." Preston kept his voice even, but his meaning was unmistakable. A flash of something surprise, or perhaps wariness, crossed Weber's face before his expression smoothed again. "Accidents happen, especially to those trying to manage more than they can handle." The threat hung in the air between them. Preston had faced dangerous men before, but usually in straightforward confrontations rather than this dance of veiled intimidation. He measured his response carefully, aware that escalation now might endanger Sarah later. "Accidents do happen," he agreed, "sometimes to those who cause them." For a tense moment, the four men remained motionless, the only sound the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof or the distant call of a bird. Then Weber touched his hat again, the gesture no less mocking than before. "We'll be in the area another day, in case Mrs. Ellis wishes to discuss terms directly." He wheeled his horse, the other men following suit. Over his shoulder he added, "Good day, Mr. York." Preston watched them ride away, his unease growing rather than diminishing. These weren't simple roughnecks, but calculated businessmen using intimidation as a tool. Their approach suggested Harrington's operation was expanding with purpose, accumulating land by whatever means necessary. By the time Preston reached Sarah's cabin, dusk was settling over the land. He found her on the porch, mending a shirt by the last light of day. The domestic scene, so contrary to the tension of his recent encounter, struck him powerfully, reinforcing his determination to protect what they were building together. "Harrington's men were here," he said without preamble, dismounting and securing his horse. "Or rather, on my land, asking about you." Sarah set aside her mending, her expression growing serious as Preston recounted the conversation. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "They won't stop, will they?" she said finally. "Even if I refuse again, they'll find ways to pressure me." "Us?" "Probably not," Preston agreed. "Men like Harrington view resistance as a temporary inconvenience, not a final answer." "What do we do?" Preston joined her on the porch, taking the chair beside hers. "We have options. Legal ones first. Ensure both our deeds are properly registered, boundaries clearly marked. Make the sheriff aware of threats, even implied ones. And if legal measures aren't enough, then we defend what's ours." Preston's voice hardened slightly. "I won't be intimidated off my land, and I won't let them threaten you." Sarah reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Our land," she corrected quietly. "What's ours?" The simple amendment carried profound meaning. Preston turned to face her fully, searching her expression in the fading light. "Sarah, are you saying that we're in this together?" "Yes." Her voice was steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "I've been alone, Preston. I've been married. And I've been alone again. I know which I prefer." Preston's heart pounded as he recognized the significance of her words. "Are you proposing to me, Sarah Ellis?" A smile curved her lips. "I'm suggesting we formalize what's already true. This partnership we've been building, it's about more than adjoining properties or shared labor." "It is," he agreed, reaching to touch her cheek gently. "But I should be the one asking, properly." Sarah's smile widened. "Then ask." Preston took both her hands in his, suddenly acutely aware of the imperfection of the moment. No ring prepared, no carefully planned words, the threat of Harrington's men still hovering in the background. Yet somehow, the circumstances seemed fitting for a relationship forged in practicality and strengthened through crisis. "Sarah Ellis, will you marry me? Join our lives and our lands, face whatever comes together." Tears shimmered in Sarah's eyes, but her voice remained strong. "Yes, Preston York. I will." He kissed her then, a seal on their promise more binding than any formal document. When they separated, both slightly breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "We should ride to town tomorrow. Make it official before Harrington's men return." Sarah nodded, practical even in this emotional moment. "And send word to Reverend Collins. He performs services twice monthly in Kingfisher." The rapid timeline didn't strike either of them as unusual. In frontier life, decisions often needed to be made and acted upon quickly, whether regarding weather, livestock, or matters of the heart. Their courtship had been unconventional but thorough in its way. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable and most capable, shared hardships and triumphs, and built a foundation of mutual respect before love blossomed fully. That night, Preston stayed again in Sarah's guest room, though both were keenly aware it would likely be the last time such separation was necessary. They talked late into the night, planning their immediate future, the legal arrangements, the practical matters of combining households, the improvements they would prioritize for their united properties. Morning brought both anticipation and vigilance. They rode to Kingfisher together, alert for any sign of Harrington's men, but reached town without incident. The courthouse clerk was surprised, but efficient in recording their intent to marry and updating property records to reflect their planned union. The reverend was located at the small church on the town's edge, and arrangements were made for a ceremony 3 days hence. News traveled quickly in a small community. By the time Preston and Sarah completed their business, congratulations were being offered by townsfolk they encountered on the street. Harold Jenkins insisted on providing a wedding gift of fine coffee and imported tea, while the dressmaker pressed Sarah to accept alterations to a ready-made dress suitable for a bride. "Folks are happy for us," Preston observed as they prepared to ride home, supplies for the coming days loaded in his wagon. "More than I expected. People appreciate stability," Sarah replied. "Two established ranchers joining forces means something permanent in a place where so many come and go." The perspective was characteristic of her insightful nature. Preston nodded, understanding that their union represented more than personal happiness to the community. It was a statement of commitment to the land and the future of Kingfisher itself. As they traveled homeward, Preston found himself experiencing an unfamiliar emotion: contentment. Not the temporary satisfaction of a job well done or a profitable season, but a deeper sense that his life was aligning with its proper course. The solitude he had once cherished now seemed a poor substitute for the partnership he had found with Sarah. They were within sight of their adjoining properties, when Sarah suddenly reined in her horse, pointing toward a plume of smoke rising in the distance. "Preston, that's coming from your ranch house." They abandoned the wagon and spurred their horses forward, covering the remaining distance at a gallop. As they crested the final rise, Preston's worst fears were confirmed. His home was ablaze, flames already consuming most of the structure while 3 mounted figures watched from a safe distance. Weber and his companions turned at their approach, and even from a distance, Preston could see the smug satisfaction on the leader's face. The message was unmistakable. Their defiance had consequences. Preston's first instinct was to reach for his revolver, but Sarah's hand on his arm stopped him. "That's what they want," she said urgently. "A reason to claim self-defense." She was right, of course. 3 against 2 with the element of surprise lost would be poor odds even if Preston were willing to risk Sarah's safety in a gunfight. Instead, they approached steadily, stopping at a distance that allowed conversation without vulnerability. Preston kept his voice calm despite the rage building inside him as he watched his home burn. "This was a mistake, Weber." The man shrugged, unperturbed. "Unfortunate accident." "Old buildings, dry wood hazardous combination." "We've recorded our marriage intentions in Kingfisher," Sarah said clearly. "Both properties are legally protected under joint ownership filing. The sheriff has been notified of previous threats." This information seemed to give Weber pause, though he recovered quickly. "Congratulations on your nuptials. Mr. Harrington will be disappointed to lose the opportunity for business, but such is life." His tone hardened slightly. "Of course, ranching remains challenging. Accidents, market fluctuations, unexpected difficulties, so many potential setbacks for even established operations." "Deliver a message to Harrington," Preston said, his control thinning. "The York Ellis Ranch is not for sale. Not now, not ever. Any further accidents will be met with the full force of the law and, if necessary, beyond it." Weber studied them both, perhaps measuring their resolve against his employer's determination. Whatever calculation he made seemed to favor caution, at least temporarily. "I'll convey your position." He touched his hat in mock respect. "Good day to you both, and again, congratulations." The 3 men rode away, leaving Preston and Sarah to watch helplessly as the ranch house, Preston's home for 5 years, burned beyond salvation. They managed to save the barn and outbuildings through exhausting effort, but by nightfall, only smoldering ruins remained of the main structure. Exhausted and soot-covered, they returned to Sarah's cabin in silence. The day that had begun with such promise now ended in loss and uncertainty. Preston felt the weight of failure despite knowing there was little he could have done to prevent the destruction. "I'm sorry," Sarah said as they sat at her table, untouched cups of coffee between them. "This is because of me, because you helped me, because we're together." Preston shook his head firmly. "No, this is because men like Harrington believe they're entitled to whatever they desire. You rejected him, I defied him, either was enough to make us targets. What do we do now?" The question echoed their earlier conversation, but with greater urgency. Preston considered carefully before answering. The obvious immediate solution was to rebuild on his property, but that would mean months of construction during which they would be vulnerable to further intimidation. Additionally, rebuilding in the same location might be perceived as weakness, an admission that Harrington's tactics had succeeded in disrupting their lives. "We combine operations here," he said finally. "Your cabin is sufficient for now. We'll expand it before winter, add rooms as needed. Move my remaining stock to your pastures temporarily, then establish new boundary lines that make sense for our combined operation." Sarah nodded slowly. "And my horse breeding program, still viable, more so with combined resources." Preston reached for her hand across the table. "This isn't how I wanted to start our life together, Sarah, but it doesn't change what matters." "No," she agreed, squeezing his hand. "It doesn't." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Preston salvaged what he could from the ruins of his home, primarily metal tools, and a few personal items that had survived the flames, while Sarah reorganized her cabin to accommodate 2 people. They transferred Preston's livestock to Sarah's pastures, a temporary measure until proper fencing could establish new grazing areas. Despite the circumstances, they maintained their plan to marry on the appointed day. The ceremony in Kingfisher's small church was brief but meaningful, attended by a surprising number of townspeople who seemed eager to show support against the implied threat Harrington represented. Sarah wore the altered dress the dressmaker had provided, while Preston donned his best shirt and a new vest Harold Jenkins insisted on providing. They spoke their vows clearly, promising to face life's challenges together, words that carried particular weight given recent events. The townspeople organized a small celebration afterward, providing food and music in the church hall. It was during these festivities that Sheriff Miller approached Preston privately. "Heard about your troubles," the lawman said without preamble. "Can't prove Harrington's involvement without witnesses willing to testify." "I understand," Preston replied, having expected as much. Frontier justice often operated within practical limitations. "That said," Miller continued, "Harrington's been pushing boundaries throughout the county. You 2 aren't the only ones affected." He lowered his voice. "The territorial governor's office is taking interest. Allegations of intimidation, possible land fraud. Nothing concrete yet, but eyes are watching. The information was unexpected but welcome. Anything we can do to help?" "Document everything. Any encounters, any suspicious incidents, and spread the word among neighboring ranchers quietly. Strength in numbers, York." Preston nodded, filing the advice away for future action. The conversation reinforced his growing sense that their struggle against Harrington was part of a larger pattern, one that might eventually find resolution through collective resistance rather than individual defiance. When he and Sarah finally departed for her cabin, now their shared dwelling, Preston felt oddly optimistic despite recent losses. They had allies, however informal, and the beginnings of a strategy beyond mere reaction to threats. Their first night as husband and wife was both awkward and tender, the natural culmination of growing feelings, yet still an adjustment for 2 people accustomed to independence. Sarah had moved her belongings to make space for Preston's salvaged possessions, creating a physical representation of their merged lives. In the privacy of what was now their bedroom, they discovered each other with gentle curiosity. Preston found Sarah's passion matched his own, her responsiveness belying the practical exterior she presented to the world. Their joining felt like confirmation of all they'd promised: partnership in every sense, comfort in shared vulnerability. Afterward, as they lay together in the darkness, Sarah traced idle patterns on Preston's chest. "I never expected this," she admitted quietly. "After Thomas died, I thought that chapter of my life was closed forever." Preston covered her hand with his own. "I never expected any of it. You, this partnership, even caring about the future beyond the next season. And now I can't imagine returning to what was before." He kissed her forehead gently. "Whatever comes, Harrington, drought, whatever challenges, we face it together." "Together," Sarah agreed, settling against him. The word had become their touchstone, a reminder of the fundamental change in both their lives. No longer solitary figures against an unforgiving landscape, but partners sharing both burdens and joys. The revelation that such partnerships strengthened rather than diminished them individually was perhaps the greatest surprise of all. The weeks following their wedding established a new normal. They expanded Sarah's garden to accommodate increased needs, began construction on an addition to the cabin, and developed plans for improving both cattle and horse operations. Preston introduced Sarah to his business contacts in Fort Worth, establishing her as an equal partner in trading relationships that would benefit their combined ranch. Harrington's men did not return immediately, though rumors reached them of similar intimidation attempts against other small ranchers in neighboring counties. Preston and Sarah used this respite to strengthen their position, physically improving their property's defensibility and legally ensuring all documentation was impeccable. They also began building alliances with surrounding ranchers, hosting informal gatherings where experiences with Harrington's operation could be shared. Sheriff Miller's suggestion of strength in numbers proved prescient. By late summer, a loose coalition had formed among property owners determined to resist corporate expansion through intimidation. It was during this period that Sarah discovered she was expecting a child, news that transformed their practical partnership into something even more profound. The prospect of creating family beyond themselves added urgency to their efforts to secure their future and heightened the stakes of their resistance to Harrington's threats. Preston's protective instincts intensified, though he was careful not to smother Sarah's independence. She continued working alongside him, adapting tasks as needed but refusing to be relegated to purely domestic duties. Her expertise with the horses proved invaluable as their breeding program began taking shape, with 2 promising foals already showing the characteristics they'd selected for. The cabin addition was completed by early fall, providing additional living space and a proper office for managing ranch operations. They celebrated this milestone with a small gathering of neighboring ranchers, an event that served both social and strategic purposes as they continued building community resistance to Harrington's expansion. During this gathering, news arrived that would ultimately resolve the threat hanging over their future. The territorial governor had ordered an investigation into Harrington's business practices, following multiple complaints of intimidation and possibly fraudulent land acquisitions. While the investigation would take time to complete, its mere existence created breathing room for those who had faced pressure to sell. "It won't end immediately," Sheriff Miller cautioned when he delivered this information. "Men like Harrington don't surrender power easily, but it's a beginning." The assessment proved accurate. Though direct intimidation ceased following the announcement of the investigation, more subtle pressures continued difficulty securing credit at previously accommodating banks, unexpected resistance from traditional buyers at livestock auctions, delays in processing routine paperwork at territorial offices. Yet these challenges proved manageable when faced together. Preston and Sarah's combined resources provided buffer against financial manipulation, while their growing network of allies created alternative channels for business when traditional ones became obstructed. By the time winter settled over Kingfisher, their position was secure enough that Preston could focus on preparing for their child's arrival rather than defending against external threats. He expanded the cabin's newest room into a proper nursery, crafting furniture himself from the plentiful cedar that grew on their combined property. Sarah, despite the physical changes of pregnancy, maintained her involvement in ranch operations, particularly the horse breeding program that had become her special domain. The first sales from this venture proved exceptionally profitable, validating her vision and providing capital for further expansion. Their son was born on a clear February morning in 1879, delivered by the midwife from Kingfisher with Preston's anxious assistance. They named him Thomas Preston York, honoring both Sarah's first husband and his father, a choice that reflected their understanding that past and present could coexist without conflict. Holding his son for the first time, Preston experienced a completion of the transformation that had begun the day he crested the hill to find Sarah feeding his cattle. The solitary existence he had once valued now seemed incomprehensibly empty compared to the richness of family and community he had discovered. "He has your eyes," Sarah observed from the bed, exhausted but radiant, "and your determination." Preston smiled as the infant gripped his finger with surprising strength. "Poor boy has no chance of a lazy disposition with us as parents." Sarah laughed softly. "No, but he'll know he's loved, and that some things are worth fighting for." As spring returned to Kingfisher, bringing new growth and possibilities, the York-Ellis ranch flourished under its owner's combined vision. The territorial investigation into Harrington's practices continued, gradually dismantling the threat his operation had represented. Several smaller ranchers who had sold under pressure were able to reclaim their properties through legal proceedings, further weakening the corporate consolidation that had threatened the region. Preston and Sarah expanded their operations thoughtfully, balancing growth with sustainability in a way that honored the land while securing their family's future. Their home grew alongside their business, first with additional rooms to accommodate ranch hands during busy seasons, then with a proper second story that provided views across their combined property. Young Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious child who inherited his parents' connection to the land and their determination in the face of challenges. By his third birthday, he was already helping with simple chores, solemnly feeding chickens under Sarah's guidance or sitting tall in the saddle before Preston on morning rides. The horse breeding program gained regional recognition, with buyers traveling from as far as Kansas City to purchase stock known for intelligence and endurance. The cattle operation prospered as well, benefiting from Preston's experienced management and Sarah's innovative approaches to grazing rotation. In the spring of 1883, their family expanded again with the birth of a daughter, Emma Rose. Sarah's labor was shorter this time but no less intense, and Preston's pride no less profound when he first held his daughter. Thomas, now 4, approached his sister with solemn curiosity, promising with childish gravity to teach her everything he knew about ranching when she was bigger. By their 5th wedding anniversary, Preston and Sarah had created something neither could have envisioned when they first encountered each other. A thriving family enterprise built on mutual respect and shared purpose, supported by a community they had helped strengthen through collective action. The evening of their anniversary, after the children were asleep, Preston and Sarah sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant hues. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind possible only between people who had weathered significant challenges together. "You ever think about that morning?" Sarah asked finally. "When you found me feeding your cattle?" Preston smiled at the memory. "Often. I was so indignant, ready to run off this presumptuous woman who'd taken liberties with my livestock. And I was terrified you'd demand immediate payment I couldn't provide." Sarah leaned against his shoulder. "Never imagined we'd end up here." "No," Preston agreed, his arm sliding around her waist, "but I'm grateful every day that we did." The simple truth needed no elaboration. From unexpected beginnings had grown a life richer and more fulfilling than either had dared hope for, proof that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single act of kindness. even when offered to a stranger's cattle on a Texas morning. As darkness settled fully over their land, Preston and Sarah York returned to the home they had built together, not just the physical structure, but the life it contained. The solitary cowboy and the determined widow had found in each other not just survival, but prosperity of spirit that transcended material success. Together, they had transformed loss into legacy, creating a future secure not only in land and livestock, but in the enduring bonds of family and community. It was a quintessentially American story, one of resilience, adaptation, and the profound truth that independence and interconnection could not only coexist, but strengthen each other when founded on mutual respect and shared purpose. And as they closed their door against the night, the lights of their home stood as a beacon across the Texas landscape, a testament to love discovered in the most practical of circumstances and nurtured through the most challenging of times. For Preston and Sarah York, the greatest cattle drive of all had been the journey from solitude to partnership, from suspicion to trust, from mere survival to a life fully and joyfully lived.